50 minutes before my cancer surgery, my husband texted me, "I want a divorce. I am not built for a sick wife." The patient in the next bed set a napkin by my face. "If I survive this, marry me," I joked. He said, "Okay." A nurse froze and stared at me. Do you know who he really is? Before I continue this story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been pushed to the edge and decided to push back. My name is Serena Caldwell. I am 32 years old, and I work as a senior mergers and acquisitions auditor for one of the largest financial firms in Atlanta. For the past 7 years, my life revolved around two things: finding hidden assets in corporate spreadsheets and building what I thought was a flawless marriage with my husband, Marcus. Marcus was 34, a vice president of tech sales who loved the sound of his own voice and the reflection of his own face. We were the quintessential power couple. We drove the right cars, lived in the right zip code, and attended the right charity galas. But as I lay in a freezing hospital bed wearing a paper-thin gown, none of that mattered. I was 50 minutes away from a double mastectomy. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a sterile buzzing sound that made my headache worse. The heart monitor next to me beeped in a steady, rhythmic reminder that I was still breathing. I was terrified, but I was ready to fight for my life. That was when my phone vibrated on the plastic tray table next to my bed. I reached for it, expecting a message of encouragement from Marcus. He had told me he was grabbing a coffee from the cafeteria and would be right back to hold my hand before the anesthesia took over. Instead, I saw a text notification that made the blood in my veins run ice cold. I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over again. "I want a divorce. My lawyer will email you the paperwork. I am not built to be a nursemaid to a sick wife. I am sorry, Serena, but I have to protect my own peace." My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, thinking the medication they had given me was causing hallucinations, but the screen did not change. As I sat there paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of his timing, a second notification popped up on my screen. This one was from our joint banking app, a withdrawal alert for $120,000. It was our entire emergency savings account, the money we had meticulously set aside for medical expenses and rainy days. Marcus had drained it completely, leaving a balance of zero. He had timed the transfer perfectly, knowing I was about to go under the knife and would be incapacitated for days. I did not cry. As an auditor, I was trained to separate emotion from data. The data telling me that my husband was a coward and a thief was undeniable. A strange, profound silence settled over me. I slowly lowered the phone. In the bed next to mine, separated by a thin privacy curtain drawn halfway back, was another patient. He was a tall black man who looked to be in his late 30s. His face was gaunt but striking, with high cheekbones and intensely observant dark eyes. He was recovering from some procedure, wearing the same humiliating hospital attire I was, but he carried himself with an effortless, quiet authority. He had clearly heard the sharp intake of my breath and noticed the sudden rigidness of my posture. He reached over to his bedside table, picked up a folded paper napkin, and tossed it lightly onto my lap. "Dry your eyes, neighbor," he said, his voice a low, rich baritone that commanded attention. I looked from the napkin to him and let out a dry, hollow scoff. "I am not crying," I told him, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. "I am calculating. If I survive this operating table, you should marry me. I need a husband on paper just so I can legally freeze that traitor's assets and make his life a living hell." The man did not blink. He held my gaze, his dark eyes gleaming with a sudden, sharp amusement. He leaned back against his pillows, crossing his arms over his chest. "Okay," he said simply, "but you have to survive first." Before I could process his incredibly calm acceptance of my unhinged proposal, a young nurse walked into the room to check my IV line. She had caught the tail end of our exchange. She froze mid-step, her eyes darting between me and the man in the next bed. Her face went completely pale and she dropped her clipboard onto the linoleum floor with a loud clatter. "Ma'am," she stammered, her voice trembling as she looked at me, "do you have any idea who you just proposed to?" I opened my mouth to answer that I did not care if he was the hospital janitor, as long as he was willing to help me destroy Marcus. But before a single word could escape my lips, the heavy double doors of the pre-op room burst open violently. The chaos of my imploding life had officially arrived to see me off. Marching through the doorway were two women who had made it their life mission to remind me that I would never truly belong in their world. Leading the charge was Beatrice Jenkins, my 60-year-old mother-in-law. Beatrice was a woman utterly obsessed with country club status and old money aesthetics, despite the fact that her own father had been a hardworking mechanic. She was wearing a pristine white Chanel suit to a cancer ward, her posture rigid with practiced arrogance. Trailing right behind her was Victoria, my 30-year-old white sister-in-law, who was married to Marcus's younger brother Jamal. Victoria loved to play the role of the wealthy Southern belle, constantly carrying a Birkin bag and dripping with condescension. Neither of them carried flowers. Neither of them offered a single word of sympathy or comfort regarding the major operation I was about to endure. They marched right up to my bed, looking down at me as if I were an inconvenience that was ruining their afternoon schedules. Victoria did not even bother to say hello. She reached into her oversized designer bag, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and tossed them directly onto my lap, right over the napkin the stranger had given me. "Marcus needs you to sign this insurance waiver immediately," Victoria said, her voice laced with that fake sugary sweetness she used whenever she was being particularly venomous. "We cannot have your oncology bills tanking his credit score. He is up for a massive promotion, and financial liabilities like a sick ex-wife are a bad look. I told him years ago not to marry a girl from the South Side, but he never listens." Beatrice nodded in agreement, crossing her arms over her expensive suit. "Victoria is right, Serena. You need to be practical about this. Marcus has a bright future ahead of him, and you are in this situation. Furthermore, I need you to hand over the keys to your Mercedes. Jamal's car is in the shop, and since you will be bedridden for weeks if you make it through the surgery, it only makes sense that he uses it. You do not need a luxury vehicle sitting in the driveway while you are waiting to die." I stared at the two women. The sheer audacity of their demands 50 minutes before a double mastectomy was so surreal it almost felt comedic. They actually believed I was weak enough, broken enough by the cancer and the impending divorce, to just roll over and surrender. They had always underestimated me, viewing my quiet professional demeanor as submission. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about how a corporate auditor handles hostile takeovers. I slowly picked up the thick stack of divorce and insurance waiver papers from my lap. I looked Victoria dead in the eyes, maintaining unbroken eye contact as I gripped the documents firmly in both hands. With one swift, violent motion, I ripped the entire stack of papers cleanly in half. The sound of tearing paper echoed loudly in the quiet hospital room. I tossed the shredded pieces directly at Victoria's designer shoes. "Tell Marcus that if he wants a divorce, he can hire a process server and face me in a court of law," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "I am not signing away my rights, so he can buy a new sports car with the money he just stole from my account. And Beatrice, the only way Jamal is driving my car is if he steals it, which, considering his employment, history wouldn't surprise me." I shifted my gaze back to Victoria, taking in her perfectly styled blonde hair. "And Victoria," I added, a slight smirk playing on my lips, "your dark roots are showing. You really need to get that bleached before your next country club luncheon. You look cheap." Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her hair in horror, while Beatrice's jaw dropped open in absolute outrage. "How dare you speak to us that way?" Beatrice shrieked, her face turning a deep shade of crimson. "We are your family." "You were my family," I corrected her, settling back into my pillows. "Now you are just two trespassers standing in my hospital room." I pressed the call button on my bed rail. Before Beatrice could launch into another tirade, two surgical orderlies entered the room to wheel me away to the operating theater. They expertly maneuvered the bed past the sputtering, angry women. As they wheeled me out into the hallway, I glanced back at the man in the bed next to mine. He was watching the entire scene with an expression of deep respect and unmistakable intrigue. He gave me a single slow nod. I held on to that nod as the anesthesia mask was placed over my face, letting the darkness take me not as a victim, but as a woman preparing for war. Waking up from a double mastectomy is not like waking up from a deep sleep. It is like being dragged back to the surface of the ocean with a chest full of lead. The pain was immediate and suffocating, a tight burning sensation across my ribs that made every shallow breath feel like shattered glass. I blinked against the harsh lighting of the recovery room, trying to moisten my dry mouth. The surgical oncologist stood at the foot of my bed, her face tired but smiling. "The operation was a complete success, Serena," she told me gently. "We got clear margins. You have a long road of recovery ahead, but you are going to be okay." Before I could fully process the relief of those words, the heavy wooden door to my room opened, and a hospital billing administrator walked in, looking incredibly uncomfortable. She carried a tablet and avoided meeting my eyes. "I am so sorry to disturb you, Ms. Caldwell," she began hesitantly, "but we have an urgent administrative issue. Your health insurance card has just been declined. The system is showing that the primary policyholder has reported you as deceased, and the policy has been terminated." The heart monitor next to me spiked. Deceased. Marcus had not just asked for a divorce and stolen my savings. He had actively contacted his human resources department and committed insurance fraud by declaring me dead. He did this to instantly terminate my health coverage right in the middle of a massive surgical procedure, leaving me completely liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical debt. I knew exactly why he did it. By declaring me deceased, he could expedite a life insurance payout and immediately add his 24-year-old assistant, whom I knew he had been inappropriately texting, to his coverage as a domestic partner. He wanted to wipe me off the grid before I even woke up from anesthesia. Ms. Caldwell, the administrator, continued looking sympathetically at my bandaged chest. "We need an alternative form of payment or a valid credit card on file to proceed with your post-operative care." I closed my eyes and took a slow, agonizing breath, pushing through the fog of the pain medication. The sheer level of financial sabotage Marcus was attempting was staggering, but he had made a critical, fatal miscalculation. He let his arrogance blind him to the actual facts of our household finances. He forgot who the real breadwinner in our marriage was. "Can you reach into my overnight bag in the closet and hand me my laptop?" I asked the administrator, my voice raspy but surprisingly steady. She looked concerned. "You really should be resting, ma'am." "Please," I insisted, "just hand me the laptop. I have to fix a clerical error." Reluctantly, she brought me my sleek silver laptop. I rested it carefully on my thighs, wincing as the movement pulled at my stitches. I flipped open the screen and connected to the hospital network. Marcus had assumed that because he worked in tech sales, his benefits were superior, but as a senior auditor for a major financial firm, my executive compensation package included a platinum-tier healthcare plan. Marcus was a dependent on my policy, not the other way around. He had tried to cancel his own coverage through his company's portal, believing it covered me. But our primary medical billing was entirely routed through my corporate account. I logged into my company's secure HR portal. The screen illuminated my face as I navigated to the dependent coverage management section. I saw Marcus's name listed right below mine. Just last week, Marcus had undergone a $40,000 cosmetic dental procedure to get custom porcelain veneers, a vanity project he insisted was necessary for his sales pitches. That procedure had been pre-approved under my insurance, and the billing was scheduled to process today. With 3 deliberate clicks of my trackpad, I completely severed Marcus from my healthcare plan, marking the termination effective retroactively due to marital separation. He was now personally exposed to a $40,000 dental bill that would hit his personal credit within 24 hours. But I was not done. As a financial auditor, I had a legal obligation to report fraudulent activity. I opened a new tab and navigated to the State Insurance Fraud Bureau's official reporting portal. I meticulously typed out a detailed report outlining Marcus's attempt to declare a living spouse deceased to claim benefits, providing his employee identification number and corporate contact details. I attached the hospital timestamps to prove the malicious intent of filing the claim while I was in surgery. I hit submit and watched the confirmation screen pop up. The hospital administrator watched me in stunned silence as I closed the laptop and handed it back to her. "Run my insurance card again," I told her calmly. "You will find the policy is perfectly active and fully funded. And please inform security that my husband, Marcus Caldwell, is permanently banned from this facility." The heavy oak door did not creak as it opened. It swung inward with a deliberate, smooth motion. I expected a nurse or perhaps the administrator back with more forms. Instead, the room felt like it had been colonized by a foreign power. Julian Sterling stood in the threshold. The sickly pale patient in the thin hospital gown had vanished, replaced by a man in a charcoal gray bespoke suit that looked like it had been stitched by angels. He carried a leather briefcase that signaled more wealth than I had seen in my entire life combined. He walked to the center of my hospital room, and the air seemed to thin. He looked at my monitors, then at my IV, and finally at me with eyes that were no longer tired, but predatory and sharp. I shifted my position, trying to look more put together, despite the drainage tubes attached to my sides. He smiled, a slow, confident movement of his lips. "You are looking much better than you were 3 hours ago," he said, his voice vibrating with a calm authority that I had not heard before. I pulled the hospital blanket up to my chin, trying to regain some sense of dignity. "You are not a patient," I stated simply. He shook his head, setting his briefcase on the visitor chair. It was a preemptive measure, an extensive health screening for executives. "I have a team of doctors who make sure I stay on top of my game. I just happen to be on the same floor as you." "My fate really is a strange thing," I muttered. "I proposed to a stranger because I wanted to bankrupt my ex-husband, and now that stranger turns out to be a titan of industry." Julian pulled a business card from his pocket. The card was heavy, thick, and felt like it was made of gold. "Sterling Global," he said. "You might have heard of us." I had heard of Sterling Global. They were the apex predators of the financial world, known for hostile takeovers that left competitors in ruins. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from the rush of adrenaline. "You have the look," he said, leaning against the wall. "That specific look of an auditor who has been pushed to the edge. You want Marcus Caldwell destroyed. I want Marcus Caldwell destroyed. That is a sentiment I can certainly work with." I sat up straighter despite the pain in my chest. "What are you proposing?" He crossed his arms. "My firm is currently in the middle of a takeover bid for the tech company where your husband holds the position of vice president. We have been looking for internal weaknesses for weeks. We have found plenty, but we lack the smoking gun. We need a lead auditor to go in and find the trail of embezzlement and fraud that I am absolutely certain exists." He looked at me, searching for hesitation. "Marcus thinks he is untouchable because he creates fake vendors and funnels money through shell companies. He thinks he is clever. I need someone who knows exactly how he hides his tracks, because I suspect you have spent the last few years auditing his personal life as much as his work." My breath hitched. He was right. Over the years, I had noticed the strange anomalies in our finances, the discrepancies in his expense reports that he always laughed off as simple clerical errors. I had been too trusting, too blinded by the marriage to look closely. But now, with my chest stapled shut and my life in ruins, the trust was gone. The auditor in me was wide awake and starving. "I have the drive," he continued, his voice low. "I have the resources, and I have the legal team to ensure that when we find what he has hidden, it will lead to federal charges, not just a pink slip. You want revenge. I want to clean up my balance sheet. It is a win for both of us." The room felt stiflingly small as I weighed his offer. This wasn't just a business deal. This was a war. I had nothing left to lose. I had lost my breast, my savings, my marriage, and the belief that my life was heading in a positive direction. All that remained was the anger. The sharp, cold anger that had fueled me since the moment I saw Marcus' text. I held out my hand, my fingers steady despite the IV needle taped to the back of my hand. "I accept. I will find his dirty money. I will make sure he never works in this industry again." I will take everything he thinks he owns and leave him with nothing. Julian looked down at my outstretched hand and took it with a firm, decisive grip. We are going to be very good partners, he said, his eyes narrowing in approval. Get some rest. You start work as soon as they release you. When he walked out of the room, he left behind a lingering sense of possibility. I wasn't just a patient anymore. I wasn't just an ex-wife. I was an operative. I was a weapon pointed directly at Marcus's head. The realization was better than any pain medication. I lay back against the pillows and watched the sun set through the hospital window, knowing that when the sun rose again, the game would truly begin. I watched the shadows lengthen across the white linoleum floor, counting each second. My life before surgery felt like a distant, fading memory of a woman I no longer recognized. That Serena had been compliant and polite, but the Serena I was now was cold, calculated, and ready to burn it all down to ashes. I closed my eyes and visualized the firm's headquarters, imagining the look on Marcus's face when he realized his world was ending. Every detail of my plan had to be flawless, because I knew that if I made a single mistake, the entire house of cards would come crashing down on me instead of him. Julian Sterling was a man who did not tolerate failure, so I had to be perfect. My hands reached out and gripped the edge of the blanket, tightly feeling the texture of the fabric beneath my fingertips. This was not just about money anymore. This was about justice. The kind of justice that you don't find in textbooks, but the kind you carve out for yourself when the law is too slow or too indifferent to act. I thought about the house we shared and the way Marcus had looked at me during our last dinner together. He had been so smooth, so confident, so oblivious to the storm that was about to hit him. He had no idea what was lurking in the shadows. He had no idea that his wife had been an expert auditor for the last 9 years and that she had been keeping records for a lifetime. Tomorrow I would be released, and the first thing I would do is start the hunt. The hunt for the truth, the hunt for the money, and the hunt for the end of my past life. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension in my muscles release just a fraction. I was ready to rise like a phoenix from the remains of the double mastectomy and start the systematic destruction of the man who had abandoned me at my lowest moment. The silence of the hospital room was no longer terrifying, but instead felt like a canvas waiting for me to paint a masterpiece of ruin. Everything would be meticulously tracked, and every lie would be exposed in the light of day. Marcus had made the mistake of thinking I was fragile, but he was about to discover that I was forged in fire. And fire burns much hotter than any love he had ever claimed to feel for me. The long night lay ahead, but for the first time in years I was not afraid of the dark. I was the dark now. The alliance with Julian Sterling was more than just a business deal. It was a lifeline that would pull me out of the abyss and into a future where Marcus and his deceitful family would never dare to show their faces again. I prepared myself for the days ahead, knowing that the road to revenge would be treacherous and steep, but I would walk it every step of the way without looking back. My life had officially begun at the brink of disaster. The Uber pulled up to the wrought iron gates of my home in the affluent Atlanta suburbs. The sprawling modern estate sat on 2 acres of meticulously landscaped property, a physical manifestation of my relentless 80-hour work weeks and ruthless audits. My chest ached with every pothole the driver hit, but the physical pain was completely eclipsed by the icy focus settling over my mind. I thanked the driver and stepped out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. The midday sun beat down on my shoulders as I walked toward the massive mahogany front double doors. I reached into my purse and pulled out my key, sliding it into the deadbolt. It did not turn. I pulled it out and tried again, applying more pressure, but the cylinder refused to yield. Marcus had actually changed the locks. He wasted no time trying to erase me from the very life I had financed. I dropped the useless key back into my bag. Faint bass thumped through the warm afternoon air coming from the backyard. The smell of grilled Wagyu beef and expensive charcoal drifted over the high privacy hedges. I walked slowly along the flagstone path toward the side gate, my post-operative body demanding rest, while my spirit demanded war. I pushed open the cedar gate and stepped into my own private oasis. The scene before me looked like a poorly directed reality television show. Marcus was manning the custom outdoor kitchen I had imported from Italy, flipping steaks with a ridiculously oversized spatula. Sitting under the shaded cabana were Beatrice and Victoria, clinking crystal flute glasses filled with freshly poured mimosas. A massive banner hung across the pergola reading, "Happy Freedom Day, Marcus." But the absolute centerpiece of this grotesque carnival was lounging on my imported teak sunbed right at the edge of the infinity pool. It was Chloe, his 24-year-old assistant. She was wearing a tiny designer bikini and sipping a cocktail. Worse, she was draped in the custom silk kimono I had purchased during a business trip to Kyoto. The sheer audacity of the invasion was breathtaking. They were not just celebrating my absence, they were actively colonizing my territory. I stood silently on the edge of the patio, watching them revel in my supposed demise. Beatrice laughed loudly at something Victoria said, tossing her head back. "We really should pop the vintage Dom Perignon to celebrate Marcus's upcoming promotion," Beatrice crowed. "Now that the dead weight is gone, my son can finally soar." Victoria smirked, taking another sip of her drink. "Jamal told me the Sterling global merger is going to make Marcus a millionaire. He deserves someone young and energetic to share that with. Someone who actually belongs in a country club." She shot a supportive wink at Chloe, who giggled and adjusted her sunglasses. I took a deliberate step forward, my low-heeled shoes clicking sharply against the stone pavers. The sound cut through the thumping bass of the outdoor speakers. Victoria saw me first. Her mimosa glass paused halfway to her lips, and the smug smile slid right off her face. Beatrice turned, following her daughter-in-law's gaze, and let out a sharp gasp. The music suddenly felt deafening until Marcus scrambled to grab his phone and hit mute. The silence that fell over the backyard was heavy and thick. Marcus dropped his metal spatula onto the grill grate. He stared at me, as if a ghost had just walked through the gate. He quickly recovered his shock, morphing into defensive arrogance. He marched across the patio, stopping a few feet away from me. He crossed his arms, trying to physically intimidate me with his height. "You should have stayed at the hospital," Marcus sneered, his voice echoing in the quiet yard. "I changed the locks this morning. My name is on the mortgage payments. Take your bags from the garage and leave before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing." I looked past him at Chloe, who had sat up on the sunbed, pulling my silk kimono tighter around her shoulders. She looked nervous, but tried to mask it with a defiant jut of her chin. "Hi, Serena," she said, her voice annoyingly high-pitched. "Marcus said you were staying at a recovery facility. He said the house was his now." I brought my gaze back to Marcus, refusing to show even a flicker of pain from my surgical incisions. "You moved your mistress into my home while I was on an operating table?" I stated, keeping my tone completely devoid of emotion. Marcus scoffed, stepping closer. "It is my home, Serena. I pay the bills. I told you I am done playing nursemaid to a woman who spends her whole life crunching numbers and making everyone miserable. Chloe brings light into this house. She supports my career. You just brought stress and medical bills. I am taking what is mine." Beatrice stood up from her lounge chair, smoothing down her expensive linen trousers. "Listen to my son, Serena," Beatrice commanded, walking over to stand shoulder to shoulder with Marcus. "You have overstayed your welcome in this family. Marcus is destined for greatness, and he needs a woman who can keep up with his lifestyle. Not someone who looks like a walking tragedy. You need to accept reality and walk away quietly." Victoria sauntered over, swirling the last bit of orange juice and champagne in her glass. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering critically on the slight bulge of bandages hidden beneath my loose blazer. "Do not make this harder than it has to be." Serena Victoria laughed maliciously. "Jamal looked up a women's shelter downtown that takes in unemployed sick women. I can text you the address if you need a place to crash tonight. They have free soup." The three of them stood in a unified front of cruelty, convinced they had won the war before I even fired a single shot. They expected me to break down, to scream, to cry, or to beg for my home back. They expected the sick, discarded wife to crumble under the weight of their combined humiliation. I did not scream. I did not cry. I reached a slow, steady hand into my tailored blazer pocket. My fingers wrapped around the thick manila folder I had retrieved from my secure bank deposit box on the way here. The same folder that contained the financial reality Marcus had completely ignored for the entirety of our marriage. "You have a very active imagination, Marcus," I said softly, letting my gaze sweep over the barbecue, the pool, the mistress, and the two venomous women standing by his side. "But your imagination is going to cost you everything." I slowly unclasped the metal clasp of the manila envelope I held in my hands. From inside, I slid out a stark red folder. The bright color seemed to absorb the Georgia sunlight. Marcus let out a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter. He looked back at his mother and Victoria, shaking his head as if I were a child playing a foolish game. "Look at her," he mocked, gesturing toward me with a grease-stained hand. "She is losing her mind. The medication is making her delusional. Serena, put your little papers away and get off my property before I have you removed in handcuffs." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I opened the red folder and pulled out a stack of banking statements stapled to a legally binding lease agreement. "For the past 5 years, you have transferred exactly $4,000 on the first of every month into a holding account at Sterling Global Bank." I stated, my voice cutting through the humid air with absolute precision. "You told your friends it was for the mortgage. You told your mother it was proof of your providing for our household. You told yourself it meant you owned this estate." Marcus smirked, crossing his arms. "Because it is the mortgage," he sneered. "I pay the mortgage. My name is on the transfers. I am the man of the house." "You have been paying $4,000 a month into an account, Marcus," I replied, letting a cold smile finally touch my lips. "You thought it was the mortgage. It is actually rent." The smirk vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a deep, furrowed brow of confusion. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, taking a half step forward. "I have the deed. I signed the paperwork when we bought this place." I held up a crisp white document bearing a gold-embossed notary seal. "You signed a standard residential lease agreement disguised as a cohabitation financial contribution form." "You never read what you signed, Marcus. You are too busy looking at the reflection of your custom suits in the boardroom windows to read the fine print. I bought this $1.5 million property 4 months before our wedding day. I purchased it through a blind trust using the massive signing bonuses I received when I was recruited as a lead auditor. The trust is the sole proprietor of this estate. I am the sole beneficiary of that trust. You have zero equity in this house. You have never had equity in this house. For half a decade, you have simply been my tenant. And as of this morning, you are a tenant in default." The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the sizzling of the abandoned Wagyu steaks burning on the grill, sending plumes of dark smoke into the air. Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, clutching the collar of her Chanel suit. "That is impossible," she sputtered, stepping out from under the shade of the cabana. "Georgia is an equitable distribution state. You are married to him. Half of this property belongs to my son by law. You cannot just steal a house." I shifted my gaze to Beatrice, my eyes locking onto hers with surgical focus. "I am an expert in mergers, acquisitions, and asset protection, Beatrice. I hide billions of dollars for international corporations. Do you honestly believe I would not know how to legally shield my own real estate from a man whose credit score is lower than his golf handicap?" The trust was established before the marriage. The funds were strictly non-marital assets. He contributed to nothing but his monthly rent. I am his landlord, and he is currently trespassing. Victoria scoffed, but her voice lacked its usual venomous bite. She stepped forward, clutching her mimosa glass so tightly her knuckles were white. "You are bluffing," she snapped. "You cannot just evict someone without notice. There are squatters' rights. There are eviction moratoriums. You cannot just throw him out on the street." I turned to Victoria, finding her sudden desperation entirely pathetic. "Squatters' rights apply to people who peacefully occupy an abandoned space," I corrected her smoothly. "Marcus just sent me a text message 50 minutes before my cancer surgery demanding a divorce, and stating his intent to abandon the marriage. I have the time-stamped message right here. Furthermore, my security cameras recorded him changing the locks on a property he does not own less than 2 hours ago. That is destruction of private property and an illegal lockout. Under state law, I do not need a 30-day eviction notice for a hostile intruder who has committed vandalism. I just need the police. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, holding it up for them to see. I have already contacted the local precinct. I informed them that a disgruntled ex-tenant broke into my home, changed my locks, and is currently hosting an unauthorized gathering on my patio. They are dispatching a unit right now. Marcus's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted around the luxurious backyard, suddenly realizing that none of it belonged to him. The custom outdoor kitchen, the infinity pool, the imported stone fire pit, all of it was mine. He had been living a lie funded by my foresight. "Serena," he stammered, his voice losing all its arrogant bravado. "You cannot do this. All my clothes are inside. My golf clubs, my watches. We are a family. We can talk about this." "There is nothing left to talk about," I said, dropping the red folder onto a nearby glass patio table. "You made your choice when you drained our joint savings account while I was being prepped for anesthesia. You made your choice when you tried to cancel my health insurance to pay for your mistress." I glanced over at Chloe, who had completely frozen on the sunbed. She looked terrified, clutching the stolen silk kimono as if it were a shield. She was finally realizing that the wealthy, successful vice president she thought she was stealing was actually just a broke tenant about to be thrown out on the street. "You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate my property before I have you arrested for trespassing," I stated, my voice echoing off the stone walls of the estate. "You can take whatever fits into the trunk of your car. The rest will be boxed up and left on the curb by a professional moving crew tomorrow morning at your expense." Marcus stood paralyzed, his chest heaving as the reality of his ruin crashed down upon him. Beatrice began to hyperventilate, fanning her face rapidly, while Victoria frantically pulled out her phone, desperately scrolling for a solution that did not exist. "10 minutes, Marcus," I reminded him, tapping the face of my watch. "The clock is ticking. And I suggest you turn off the grill. You are burning my patio." Beatrice's face twisted into a mask of pure indignation. She stepped forward, her voice rising to a shrill screech that disturbed the tranquility of the upscale neighborhood. "Family values," she screamed, her hands waving erratically in the air. "You know nothing about family values, Serena. We brought you into this family, we elevated you, and this is how you repay us. By throwing your own husband out on the street like common trash. You have no class, no grace, and no respect for the sanctity of marriage." I just stared at her, completely unfazed by her theatrics. "Beatrice, your son brought his mistress into my home while I was having cancerous tissue removed from my body. Do not preach to me about the sanctity of marriage while she is standing right there wearing my clothes." Victoria had heard enough. Her carefully cultivated Southern belle persona evaporated entirely, replaced by raw, unhinged fury. She lunged forward, her arms swinging in a wide arc, aiming a sharp, open-handed slap directly at my face. She wanted to physically put me in my place to punish me for daring to challenge their authority. She was fast, but my reflexes were sharper. I shot my hand up and caught her wrist mid-air. The impact stung, but the adrenaline rushing through my veins masked any physical pain from my surgery. I clamped my fingers around her delicate wrist, pressing my thumb hard into the nerve. Victoria gasped in pain, her fingers going slack. The crystal flute slipped from her grasp, shattering on the stone pavers, sending sticky mimosa and glass shards splashing across her designer shoes. "Touch me again, and I will break it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying a lethal edge that made her freeze completely. I stared directly into her panicked eyes, letting her feel the absolute certainty of my threat. I slowly released her arm and she stumbled backward, cradling her wrist against her chest like a wounded bird. Before anyone else could make a move, the heavy sound of tires crunching on the driveway echoed from the front of the house, followed immediately by the sharp chirp of a police siren. I had not bluffed. Two patrol cars had just pulled through the wrought iron gates, their red and blue lights flashing brilliantly against the pristine white columns of my home. Three uniformed officers rounded the corner of the house, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They took in the scene. The shattered glass, the burnt steaks smoking on the grill, Victoria cradling her wrist, and Marcus standing completely paralyzed. We received a call about a trespassing in progress and a hostile eviction. The lead officer stated, his authoritative gaze sweeping over the patio. He looked directly at me. "Are you the homeowner, ma'am?" "I am," I replied, smoothing down the front of my blazer. "I have the deed and trust documents right here in this folder. These four individuals are unauthorized to be on the premises. I have asked them to leave, and they have become hostile and combative." The officer reviewed the paperwork I handed him, nodding as he verified the state seals and signatures. He turned to Marcus. "Sir, you and your guests need to vacate the property immediately. You have exactly 5 minutes to gather your personal effects from the driveway, or you will be placed under arrest." Marcus tried to argue, his voice cracking with utter humiliation. "Officer, wait, this is a terrible misunderstanding. I live here. My clothes are upstairs. My life is in this house. You cannot just throw me out. This document says you are a tenant in default, sir." The officer replied, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "This is a civil matter for the courts, but right now the homeowner wants you gone. Move, now." The public humiliation that followed was absolute perfection. The officers escorted them through the side gate and down the long, winding driveway. The commotion had drawn the attention of the entire neighborhood. The Harrisons from next door, the incredibly wealthy couple Beatrice had been desperately trying to impress for 3 years, were standing on their manicured lawn, watching the entire spectacle unfold. Other neighbors had stepped out of their luxury cars, pausing on the sidewalk, to witness the very public downfall of Marcus Caldwell. Chloe was practically jogging down the driveway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, desperate to escape the glaring strobe of the police lights. Beatrice was weeping openly now, her white Chanel suit looking utterly ridiculous, as she was hurried along by a stern-faced deputy. Victoria kept her head down, trying to shield her face from the watching neighbors, her shattered pride evident in every hurried step. Marcus reached the street looking like a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking as he opened his rideshare app. "Fine!" he yelled back toward the house, trying to salvage some microscopic shred of his shattered ego. "I will book us suites at the Four Seasons. We do not need this place anyway. I will have my lawyers drain you dry by Friday." He tapped his screen aggressively, waiting for the confirmation. But the confirmation never came. Instead, a red error message flashed across his display. He frowned, opening his banking app. I watched from the front porch, leaning against the heavy mahogany door, a cold smile forming on my lips. "What is wrong with this thing?" Marcus muttered, frantically tapping his screen. He pulled out a sleek metal credit card and tried manually entering the numbers. Declined. He tried another card. Declined. He tried his premium debit card. Account frozen. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine across the expanse of the driveway. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. When I had logged into my corporate portal at the hospital, I had not just canceled his health insurance and reported him for fraud. I had systematically frozen every single joint financial account we shared. I had routed all automatic deposits into a secure, isolated account under my name only. He had no access to the liquid cash, no access to the credit lines, and absolutely zero purchasing power. He was standing on the curb of an upscale suburban street with his mother, his sister-in-law, and his young mistress, and he could not even afford to buy them a cup of coffee, let alone book a luxury hotel suite. He was utterly trapped, exposed, and penniless in front of the very people he had tried to impress. The police officers stood by their cruisers, arms crossed, waiting for them to leave the perimeter. Marcus looked at his phone, then at me, the arrogant vice president of tech sales, reduced to a desperate man stranded on a sidewalk. The sweet taste of revenge had never felt so satisfying. I turned my back on the pathetic scene unfolding at the end of my driveway and walked inside, locking the heavy mahogany doors behind me. The silence of the empty house was a stark contrast to the chaos I had just orchestrated, but I knew the peace would be short-lived. Marcus was arrogant, but he was also deeply entitled. Once the shock wore off, and the reality of his frozen bank account set in, his desperation would turn into rage. He would inevitably try to force his way back in, demanding what he believed was rightfully his. My physical state was still vulnerable, my chest aching with a dull, throbbing intensity that demanded heavy painkillers and rest. I could not risk a physical altercation, nor did I want to spend my recovery looking over my shoulder. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Julian Sterling containing a single address for a high-security residential building in the heart of downtown Atlanta, followed by a brief text. "The car is waiting at your back gate. My penthouse is prepped. Let the audit begin." I packed a single sleek duffel bag with my essentials, grabbed my heavily encrypted work laptop, and slipped out through the rear garden entrance. A black executive town car was idling in the alleyway exactly as promised. The drive into the city was a blur of towering glass and steel, pulling me away from the toxic suburban illusion I had been trapped in for years. Julian's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a private, ultra-exclusive high-rise. When the private elevator doors glided open, I stepped into a fortress of modern luxury. The space was vast, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. But I was not interested in the view. My eyes immediately locked onto the massive dining room table. Julian's team had completely cleared it, transforming the space into a high-tech war room. 3 ultra-wide high-definition monitors were arranged in a semicircle connected to a secure server tower. A stack of encrypted hard drives sat neatly next to a steaming cup of herbal tea. Julian emerged from a hallway looking effortlessly sharp in a tailored charcoal dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, projecting the aura of a man who commanded empires before lunch. He walked over and tapped his finger against the stack of silver hard drives. "This is the complete, unredacted raw data room for Marcus's tech firm," Julian said, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a predatory gleam. "Every expense report, every vendor contract, every wire transfer for the past 4 years. The acquisition is scheduled to close in exactly 3 weeks. The board thinks Marcus is a superstar who doubled their sales revenue. Prove them wrong." I took a sip of the warm tea, letting the soothing liquid ease the dryness in my throat. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair, waking up the monitors. Marcus always thought my job was boring. He used to joke to his friends that I was just a glorified human calculator, a woman who stared at spreadsheets until her eyes bled. He never understood that numbers are a language. Numbers tell a story that cannot be manipulated by charm, cannot be hidden by an expensive suit, and cannot be lied away with a smooth smile. I cracked my knuckles, ignoring the sharp pull of my surgical incisions, and plunged headfirst into the data. For the next 8 hours, the physical world faded away. I existed entirely within the glowing rows of digital ledgers. I started by isolating Marcus's specific division, filtering the data to highlight discretionary spending, third-party vendor payouts, and client entertainment accounts. Marcus was the vice president of tech sales, which meant he had almost unilateral authority to approve massive departmental budgets without requiring secondary executive signatures. It was a massive oversight by his company, and a fatal flaw I was about to exploit. Around 2 in the morning, my eyes caught a subtle recurring anomaly. It was a tiny thread, but in my line of work, pulling a tiny thread usually unravels the entire sweater. I noticed a consistent pattern of high-dollar payouts to a third-party logistics and marketing firm listed simply as Alpha Innovations, LLC. The payments were categorized as consulting fees and strategic marketing outreach, but the deliverables attached to the invoices were incredibly vague. There were no campaign metrics, no physical marketing materials, and no actual proof of services rendered, just perfectly round numbers hitting the ledger on the 15th of every month, ranging from $8,000 to $15,000 a pop. I ran the LLC through a state business registry database, pulling the public registration documents. The company had been formed 2 years ago, right around the time Marcus was promoted to vice president. The registered agent was a shell corporation, but the physical mailing address attached to the banking routing numbers made my breath hitch. It was the exact address of a luxury high-rise apartment complex in Midtown. The very same luxury complex where Chloe, his 24-year-old mistress, resided. Marcus had not just been buying her designer handbags and paying her expensive rent. He had been creating fake vendor invoices and routing his own company's corporate funds directly into an account that funded her entire lifestyle. He was writing off his infidelity as a corporate marketing expense. My heart hammered against my ribs, a thrilling rush of adrenaline completely overriding my need for sleep. I dug deeper, my fingers flying across the keyboard. If he was bold enough to do it once, he was arrogant enough to do it twice. I ran a secondary search looking for matching vendor invoice templates. Within 20 minutes, I found another shell company, this one named Southern Heritage Consulting. I pulled the wire transfer dates for this second fake vendor. The payouts were smaller, exactly $2,500 wired consistently on the first day of every month. I cross-referenced that exact amount with the financial profiles I had built on his family. I let out a sharp, breathless laugh that echoed in the quiet penthouse. $2,500 was the exact to the penny cost of Beatrice's exorbitant monthly country club dues. The dues she constantly bragged about, the dues she used to maintain her fake old money status among women who secretly despised her. Marcus had been siphoning stolen corporate cash to keep his mother draped in the illusion of wealth. I aggregated the data, pulling every fraudulent invoice, every fake wire transfer, and every piece of metadata connecting Marcus to the shell companies. The total amount embezzled over the last 2 years was staggering, easily crossing the threshold of $800,000. This was no longer just gross misconduct or a fireable offense. This was a massive, undeniable federal crime. He had committed wire fraud and corporate embezzlement on a massive scale, and now he was bringing that toxic liability directly to Julian Sterling's acquisition table. I leaned back in the leather chair, letting the glowing light of the monitors wash over my face. The agonizing pain in my chest was completely forgotten, replaced by a euphoric, undeniable sense of victory. I had the smoking gun. I had the undeniable, mathematically proven truth that would rip Marcus Caldwell from his pedestal and drop him straight into a federal prison cell. A cold, genuine smile spread across my face as I saved the final compiled report to a secure flash drive. The trap was fully constructed. The corporate guillotine was raised, sharpened, and waiting for the absolute perfect moment to drop. At exactly 9:15 the following morning, the sleek black phone on Julian's desk buzzed with a direct line from the ground floor security desk. I was already dressed in a tailored ivory suit, the physical pain in my chest managed by a precise dose of medication and the sheer thrill of my impending victory. I had spent the night mapping out every single fraudulent wire transfer Marcus had initiated. Julian picked up the receiver, listened for a moment, and handed it to me with an amused smirk. "Someone is throwing a spectacular tantrum in the main lobby," he murmured. I pressed the phone to my ear. The head of security sounded deeply unamused as he informed me that a blonde woman in a counterfeit Prada suit was demanding to see me, threatening to have the entire security staff fired. "Send her to the central atrium," I instructed. "I will be right down." I took the private glass elevator down 50 floors. The lobby of Sterling Global was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Vast expanses of imported Italian marble towering 30-foot ceilings and an atmosphere of absolute hushed power. It was an environment designed to make ordinary people feel incredibly small. Victoria did not look small. She looked frantic. She was pacing near the indoor waterfall, aggressively tapping her manicured nails against her leather handbag. When the elevator doors parted and I stepped out, her head snapped toward me. The pristine acoustics of the lobby echoed with the sharp click of her heels as she marched into my personal space. "You have lost your mind, Serena!" she hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic mixture of panic and rage. "Do you have any idea what you did yesterday? Marcus and my mother-in-law spent the night in a disgusting 3-star motel off the interstate. You humiliated us in front of the entire neighborhood. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I am a forensic auditor, Victoria. I deal with numbers, not feelings. If Marcus could only afford a 3-star motel after I froze the accounts he was draining, then perhaps he should have managed his non-existent finances better. Victoria's eyes narrowed into venomous slits. You think you are so clever. You think just because you play with spreadsheets you can steal a house and leave my brother-in-law on the street. You are going to fix this right now. You are going to call your little bank, unfreeze those accounts, and sign the deed of the house over to Marcus today. I let out a soft, genuine sigh. The audacity was almost breathtaking. And why exactly would I hand over my own legally purchased estate to a man who has been paying me rent for 5 years? Because if you do not, I will destroy you. Victoria spat, stepping so close I could smell the stale champagne from yesterday sweating out of her pores. Her face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic entitlement. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, dropping her voice into a vicious, calculated sneer. You're a ghetto girl playing dress-up. My family owns half this city. I will ruin you. I will make one phone call to my father. Victoria continued, and you will be blacklisted from every financial institution in Atlanta. You will never work in this town again. You will be back to wherever it is people like you come from, scrubbing floors. The silence in the grand lobby seemed to amplify her threat. Security guards shifted their weight, ready to intervene, but I raised a single hand to keep them back. I looked at Victoria, not with anger, but with the cold, clinical detachment of an apex predator observing cornered prey. I smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow smile. Victoria. I said, my voice smooth and dangerously quiet. Do you know what happens when you work in high-level forensic accounting? You learn that money leaves a paper trail, and fake money leaves the loudest trail of all. Her arrogant expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Your father is Richard Montgomery. I continued pacing slowly around her, forcing her to turn and follow my movements. He owns a regional real estate development firm. Or rather, he used to. He filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection 3 years ago. His golf course development in Buckhead went into foreclosure, and his primary residence is heavily leveraged with 3 separate secondary mortgages. The only thing your family owns in this city is a mountain of high-interest debt. Victoria stopped breathing. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her spray tan looking sallow and sickly. You have spent your entire adult life parading around country clubs, pretending to be a Southern heiress. I stated, my voice echoing off the marble walls. You act like you are American royalty, but you are drowning in debt just like Marcus. You married into his family because you thought his corporate salary would keep your sinking ship afloat. But now that I have frozen the lifeblood of your entire pathetic charade, you are panicking. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The illusion she had spent years building was being dismantled piece by piece in the middle of a corporate lobby. Do not ever threaten me with your father's connections, Victoria. The men who run this city do not answer to bankrupt developers. They answer to the people who control their capital. People like Julian Sterling. People like me. I stepped right into her personal space, looking down at her trembling frame. You came into my building to threaten me. You demanded my house to save your own fragile ego. But you have absolutely nothing to bargain with. I turned my head slightly toward the imposing head of security standing a few yards away. Marcus is a thief, Victoria, I added softly, so only she could hear. He has been embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own company to fund his mistress and your mother-in-law's country club dues. I have the files, I have the receipts. The corporate guillotine is already falling. And if you or anyone else in your parasitic family ever comes near me again, I will make sure the Financial Crimes Division investigates every single dollar your bankrupt father has touched in the last decade. I stepped back, adjusting the lapels of my blazer. Escort this woman off the premises, I commanded the security guards. If she resists, call the police and have her charged with corporate trespassing. The guards moved in immediately, grabbing Victoria by the arms of her fake Prada suit. She did not scream this time. She did not fight. The absolute realization of her total destruction had broken her. She was dragged backward across the polished marble floors, her designer heels scraping uselessly behind her, utterly humiliated in front of the morning corporate rush. I turned on my heel and walked back toward the private elevator. The audit was not over yet. The private elevator doors slid shut, sealing away the chaotic echo of the lobby and wrapping me in perfect insulated silence. I rode the 50 floors back up to the penthouse, my pulse steady and my mind exceptionally clear. I had given Victoria a taste of reality downstairs, but verbal humiliation was merely a temporary sting. To permanently eradicate a parasite, you had to pull it up by the roots. I stepped out of the elevator and walked straight back into the dining room turned war room. Julian was leaning against the edge of the mahogany table, swirling a glass of amber bourbon. He raised an eyebrow as I approached. "I need your private investigators," I said, bypassing the pleasantries and sliding right back into my leather chair. "Not the corporate compliance team. I want the shadow unit. The ex-federal agents who do not ask questions and do not leave digital footprints. I want a complete invasive forensic sweep on Victoria Montgomery and her husband Jamal. Every bank account, every offshore holding, every tax return, and every property deed for the last decade." Julian simply smirked, pulled his cell phone from his pocket, and made a single 30-second phone call. I did not have to argue with Victoria. I did not have to exchange petty insults or engage in screaming matches on manicured lawns. I let the data do the fighting for me. Over the next 48 hours, while Julian and I continued building the embezzlement case against Marcus, his private investigation team began feeding me raw intelligence on Victoria and Jamal. The encrypted files dropped into my secure server like precise artillery strikes. The results were pure, unadulterated gold. I opened the first dossier, which focused on Victoria's father, Richard Montgomery. I had already known about the Chapter 11 bankruptcy, but the investigators uncovered the rotting foundation hidden beneath it. Richard was not just a failed real estate developer. He was actively hiding from the Internal Revenue Service. 5 years ago, after his primary business collapsed under the weight of severe mismanagement, he had engaged in massive tax fraud to conceal his remaining liquidated assets. He was currently living under a carefully constructed alias in a dilapidated, humid one-bedroom condominium in Boca Raton, Florida. The man Victoria constantly bragged about, the supposed titan of Atlanta high society, was buying his groceries with prepaid debit cards to avoid triggering federal tracking algorithms. The old money empire she wielded like a weapon was nothing more than a pathetic mirage. But the true masterpiece of this financial tragedy was not Victoria's father. It was her husband. I pulled up a secondary screen and opened Victoria's public social media profiles. She posted constantly. I scrolled through a sickeningly curated timeline of excess. Photos of her carrying limited edition Hermes Birkin bags that retailed for $30,000. Videos of her driving a brand new custom-ordered Porsche Cayenne. Snapshots of lavish weekend ski trips to Aspen and front-row tickets to exclusive charity galas. Then I pulled up Jamal's verified corporate tax returns and employment history. Jamal was a mid-level regional manager at a logistics firm. His annual take-home pay after taxes was roughly $85,000. The math was not just wrong, it was entirely impossible. A single one of Victoria's handbags cost nearly half of his yearly salary. I narrowed my eyes, tapping my pen against the desk. Money never magically appears. It is always moved, shifted, or stolen. If Victoria's family was destitute and Jamal's income was thoroughly average, there was only one possible source funding this obscene lifestyle. I initiated a deep dive trace into the broader family financial web, pulling the routing numbers for Beatrice's accounts. When Marcus and Jamal's father passed away a decade ago, he had left Beatrice a highly respectable life insurance payout and a robust retirement portfolio. It was nearly $2 million housed in a high-yield annuity designed to pay out modest, sustainable dividends to keep her comfortable for the rest of her life. I cross-referenced the withdrawal history of Beatrice's annuity with Jamal's personal checking accounts. A cold, genuine laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the quiet expanse of the penthouse. It was a masterpiece of pathetic desperation. 2 years ago, Jamal had convinced his mother to grant him full power of attorney over her estate, citing her advancing age and his supposed business acumen. Since the day that ink dried, Jamal had been systematically, ruthlessly bleeding his own mother dry. I tracked dozens of unauthorized, disguised wire transfers originating from Beatrice's retirement fund. Jamal had routed the money through a dummy LLC registered in Delaware before funneling it directly into his private checking account. The motive was glaringly obvious. Victoria's country club friends were a specific breed of Southern old money. They were wealthy, elite, and deeply subtly racist. They tolerated Victoria, but they secretly sneered at Jamal, viewing him as an interloper who did not belong in their pristine, gated communities. Jamal was completely desperate to prove his worth, desperate to buy his white wife's affection, and absolutely terrified of losing her. To maintain Victoria's status among women who secretly despised him, Jamal was stealing his mother's life savings bag by bag, car by car, vacation by vacation. I leaned back in the chair, absorbing the sheer poetic irony of the entire situation. Beatrice treated her sons like flawless gods. She constantly demeaned me, criticizing my career and my background, believing her boys were destined for greatness. Yet in reality, both of her precious sons were financial parasites destroying her from the inside out. Marcus was embezzling from his tech firm to pay Beatrice's exorbitant country club dues just so she could pretend to be wealthy. Meanwhile, Jamal was embezzling from Beatrice's retirement fund to pay for Victoria's luxury goods just so she could pretend to be wealthy. It was a closed loop of absolute financial depravity. They were a family of rats feeding off each other in the dark while polishing their silver in the light. I minimized the screens and compiled every single wire transfer, every fraudulent LLC registration, and every IRS evasion document into a massive master file. Victoria had threatened to ruin me. She had threatened to cast me out of the financial world. She had no idea that she had just handed me the match to burn her entire bloodline to ash. I reached for my phone and dialed a highly placed contact I knew at the Federal Tax Fraud Division. The audit was complete. It was time for the execution. I did not pull the trigger with the federal authorities immediately. A quick, painless end was entirely too merciful for the Caldwell family, and I wanted them to feel the cold, suffocating pressure of the walls closing in before the final blow was struck. I instructed Julian's executive assistant to draft a highly formal, deliberately vague email to Jamal's corporate address. The subject line indicated a mandatory settlement discussion regarding the Caldwell family assets and the pending legal action against Marcus. I knew exactly how Jamal operated. He had always fancied himself the diplomat of the family, the calm, rational older brother who stepped in to clean up Marcus's reckless messes. He would see this as an opportunity to play the hero, to negotiate a deal that would save his mother and his brother while keeping his own hands seemingly clean. Jamal arrived at Sterling Global exactly at 2 o'clock the next afternoon. I watched him through the glass walls of the conference room as the receptionist escorted him down the long corridor. He was wearing a navy blue suit that was attempting very hard to pass as bespoke, paired with a silk tie and a polished Rolex. He projected the aura of a successful executive, but I knew the exact cost of that watch and the exact illegal origin of the funds used to purchase it. He stepped into the room with a practiced, charming smile, completely unaware that he was walking directly into a slaughterhouse. He took a seat across the vast mahogany table, steepling his fingers in a pose he had likely practiced in the mirror to project authority. "Serena," he began, his voice dropping into a soothing, patronizing register. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. I know tensions are incredibly high right now. Marcus has always been hot-headed, and Victoria let her emotions get the better of her yesterday morning. But we are all reasonable adults here. We can find a way to settle this house dispute quietly, without dragging the entire family through a drawn-out legal battle. You unfreeze Marcus's account sign over the deed, and I will personally ensure Victoria issues a formal apology." I let him speak, watching the way he leaned forward, entirely confident in his ability to charm me into submission. He actually believed I was just a scorned ex-wife, throwing a temporary tantrum. When he finished his little speech, I did not offer a polite smile. I simply slid a sleek black folder across the polished wood, stopping it exactly in the center of the table. "This is not a negotiation about the house, Jamal." I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Marcus's assets are frozen because he committed federal wire fraud. That is a matter for the authorities, and it is entirely out of my hands. I called you here to discuss a much more pressing liability." Jamal frowned, his charming facade slipping just a fraction. He uncrossed his arms, eyeing the black folder as if it were a live explosive. "What liability?" he asked cautiously, his tone losing its previous warmth. "When a vice president of a major tech firm is investigated for embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars," I explained, leaning back in my leather chair, "the federal authorities do not just look at his personal accounts. They look at his immediate family to trace where the stolen capital might have been hidden. They look for commingled funds and secondary accomplices, which means the Internal Revenue Service is preparing to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit of Beatrice's entire financial portfolio." The physical change in Jamal was instantaneous and severe. The color drained from his face so rapidly I thought he might actually pass out right there in the chair. His confident posture collapsed entirely, his shoulders hunching forward as his breathing suddenly became shallow and erratic. The pristine air conditioning of the boardroom was set to a crisp 68 degrees, but a thick bead of sweat materialized at his hairline, sliding slowly down his temple. I watched his eyes dart around the room, frantically searching for an exit strategy that did not exist. He knew. He knew exactly what an audit of Beatrice's retirement annuity would uncover. He knew the paper trail of stolen funds leading straight from his mother's life savings into his private checking account was absolute and undeniable. "Victoria likes to boast about her old money lineage." I continued, my voice sharp and precise, slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "She loves to parade her wealth in front of her country club friends, women who look down on you, Jamal. Women who tolerate your presence only because your wife dresses like she belongs in their tax bracket. But the truth is, Victoria's rich father went bankrupt 5 years ago. He is currently hiding from the IRS in a humid condominium in Florida. Her entire life is a fake, and you have been bankrupting yourself to maintain her illusion." Jamal opened his mouth, but only a dry, raspy sound escaped. He reached up with a trembling hand to loosen his silk tie, suddenly suffocating in his expensive suit. The sweat was now blooming across his forehead and upper lip, soaking into the collar of his dress shirt. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and locked my gaze directly onto his terrified, wide eyes. "If the IRS looks at Mom's accounts, Jamal, how exactly did Victoria afford a $30,000 watch while you make $70,000 a year?" He swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively. "Serena, please," he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. "You do not understand. I was managing her portfolio. I was investing it. Victoria had no idea the women at the club are so vicious to her. I just wanted to give her what she deserved. I was going to put the money back." "You stole from your own mother," I stated, laying the ultimate brutal truth bare. "You drained Beatrice's retirement fund to buy designer Birkin bags and a Porsche for a woman who would not look twice at you if you were broke. You sacrificed your own mother's survival to buy your way into a racist social circle that will drop Victoria the second the money runs out. You are not a financial manager, Jamal. You are a thief committing elder financial abuse." He slumped back in his chair, completely and utterly broken. The arrogant diplomat who had walked into the room 5 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a terrified criminal staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence. He buried his sweating face in his trembling hands, the reality of his total destruction finally settling over him. I watched Jamal stumble out of the Sterling Global boardroom, his expensive leather shoes dragging across the carpet like lead weights. I did not say another word to him. I did not need to. The seed of total panic had been planted, and I knew exactly how fast it would grow. I let him leave the fortress of my new reality, watching through the glass walls as he practically sprinted toward the elevator banks. I walked back to my glowing monitors, settling into the ergonomic chair as Julian handed me a fresh cup of herbal tea. Now came the truly entertaining part of the operation. I woke up a dormant application on my secondary screen and put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones. Marcus had always been incredibly arrogant, but his arrogance was only matched by his profound technological incompetence. During the pandemic, he had purchased a high-end voice-activated corporate recording device to practice and review his regional sales pitches. He had foolishly synced the device to our shared family iCloud network. Because I was still legally married to him and remained the primary account holder on our digital infrastructure, my access to his synced data was completely undeniably legal. After I froze Marcus's bank accounts and forced him out of our home, he and Beatrice had abandoned their cheap motel and fled to the only place left that would take them in: Jamal and Victoria's heavily mortgaged suburban estate. Marcus had dragged his work equipment with him, plugging his devices into their home network and leaving the synced microphone active on the living room coffee table. He had essentially planted a live wiretap right in the center of his own family's collapse. I tapped the spacebar, unmuting the live audio feed. For a few minutes, there was only the ambient noise of a television playing softly in the background and the clinking of fine china. Beatrice was holding court in the adjacent dining room. Then the heavy thud of a front door slamming shut vibrated through my headphones. Jamal's ragged, panicked breathing echoed through the microphone. He had driven from downtown Atlanta to the suburbs in record time. Victoria's voice cut through the audio, immediately sharp and dripping with absolute annoyance. "Where have you been?" She snapped, the sound of her heels clicking aggressively across the floor. "I have been calling you for an hour. My father is not answering his phone, and Marcus is pacing a hole in my hardwood floors. Did you get the house back from that psychotic woman or not?" There was a tense, agonizing silence. I could picture Jamal standing in the foyer, his designer suit soaked in cold sweat, staring at the woman he had committed federal crimes to impress. "We are completely ruined." "Victoria." Jamal choked out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, breathless wheeze. "The facade is over." "What are you talking about?" Victoria demanded, her tone shifting from annoyance to defensive anger. "Stop being so dramatic and tell me you fixed it." Jamal let out a sound that was half sob, half hysterical laugh. "Fixed it. Serena knows everything. She knows your father is bankrupt. She knows he is hiding from the IRS in Florida. And she knows about the money." The clicking of Victoria's heels stopped instantly. "What money, Jamal?" "The money I took," he screamed, his voice echoing violently through the house, shattering the quiet suburban afternoon. "The money for the Birkin bags. The money for the Porsche. The money for the Aspen trips. How did you think I was paying for all of that on a regional manager's salary? I stole it, Victoria. I forged power of attorney documents, and I have been draining my mother's retirement fund for 2 years to keep you draped in designer labels." A sharp, breathless gasp came through the audio feed. "You told me you were getting corporate bonuses!" Victoria shrieked, her voice reaching an unbearable shrill pitch. "You told me you were an executive partner. You stole from your own mother. Do you realize what this means? My friends at the club will crucify me. I will be a laughingstock." "You are going to be the wife of a federal inmate," Jamal roared back, the sound of a heavy object crashing against the wall vibrating through the mic. "Serena is triggering an IRS audit. They are going to trace the wire transfers. They are going to seize the cars, they are going to seize the bags, and they are going to seize this house. We have absolutely nothing left." Through my headphones, the sound of the in-laws fracturing was beautiful music. Victoria began screaming hysterically, cursing Jamal for lying to her, cursing her father for going bankrupt, and cursing me for exposing them. Jamal was shouting right back, blaming her insatiable greed and her desperate need to impress a racist country club elite that never truly accepted them in the first place. The illusion of their flawless, wealthy marriage was dissolving into toxic, bitter hatred right in front of the live microphone. But the most incredible part of the audio feed was not the shattering of Victoria's fragile ego. It was the sound of Beatrice. Despite the screaming match echoing down the hallway, despite the smashing glass and the undeniable confession of massive financial fraud, Beatrice's voice drifted through the microphone from the dining room. She was completely, utterly oblivious to the reality collapsing around her. She was living entirely within the delusion she had constructed for her golden children. "Marcus, darling." Beatrice crooned the delicate clinking of her teacup, completely at odds with the violent sobbing in the foyer. We really must start finalizing the guest list for your promotion party. When the Sterling Global acquisition closes and they make you vice president of the entire division, we simply must host a gala. I was thinking we could rent out the botanical gardens. We need to show Serena exactly what she threw away. You are destined for the boardroom, Marcus. I have always said it. Marcus did not respond. He was sitting in the same room, likely paralyzed by the realization that Julian Sterling's forensic auditor was currently dismantling his life. But Beatrice just kept talking. I listened to her plan a victory lap for a man who was about to be indicted for corporate embezzlement, funded by a retirement account that no longer existed, hosted in a house that was about to be seized by the federal government. The sheer magnitude of her cluelessness was staggering. She was standing on the deck of a sinking ship, demanding the band play louder while the icy water rushed in. I reached up and slid the headphones off my ears, resting them gently on the desk. Julian was watching me, an amused, predatory glint in his dark eyes. "How is the family reunion going?" he asked, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. I smiled, a cold, satisfied expression spreading across my face. "They are eating each other alive," I replied smoothly. "The foundation is completely gone. Now we just need to push the final button and bring the roof down on Marcus's head." The final button was scheduled to be pressed exactly at 10 o'clock the following morning. The executive boardroom of Nexus Solutions was a sprawling monument to corporate excess located on the 40th floor of a gleaming glass tower in Midtown. It was the day the Sterling Global acquisition was supposed to be finalized, a multi-million-dollar buyout that would elevate the mid-tier tech firm into the stratosphere. At the center of this triumphant atmosphere stood Marcus. I did not need to be in the room to know exactly how he was acting, but the Sterling Global Advance team had already set up the secure audiovisual feed for Julian. Through the secure tablet in the back of Julian's chauffeured Maybach, I watched Marcus holding court. He was wearing a brand-new custom-tailored navy suit that draped perfectly across his shoulders. He held a heavy silver pen in his right hand, using it to emphatically gesture as he spoke to David, the CEO of Nexus Solutions. "We absolutely crushed the third quarter projections," David Marcus boasted, flashing his signature brilliant smile. "My sales team grinded for these numbers. I personally oversaw the vendor expansion and the client outreach programs. When the Sterling capital injection hits our accounts, I am ready to take this entire division to the next level. We will completely dominate the regional market." David chuckled, clapping Marcus firmly on the shoulder. "You single-handedly secured these numbers, Marcus. The board is incredibly impressed. As soon as Julian Sterling signs that acquisition paperwork today, the senior vice president title is yours. You earned it." Marcus smoothed his silk tie, his chest puffing out with absolute unchecked hubris. He was completely detached from the catastrophic implosion currently tearing through his brother's house. In his deeply narcissistic mind, my freezing of his personal bank accounts was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, a petty speed bump that this massive corporate promotion would instantly obliterate. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his professional life was perfectly insulated from the wreckage of his personal life. The Maybach pulled to a smooth stop outside the Nexus Solutions building. I turned off the tablet and stepped out into the crisp morning air. I had chosen my armor for today very carefully. I was wearing a sharp, meticulously tailored crimson suit. The bold, saturated color was a stark, deliberate contrast to the sterile grays and blacks of the corporate world. My hair was styled in a sleek, immaculate blowout, and a pair of razor-sharp stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement. I did not look like a discarded, heartbroken wife recovering from a major medical trauma. I looked like a woman who owned the ground she walked on. I radiated pure, unadulterated power. Julian stepped out beside me, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal suit. He glanced at my crimson outfit and offered a low, appreciative chuckle. "Ready to drop the guillotine?" he asked. "The blade is already sharpened," I replied smoothly. "Let us go." When we walked into the lobby of Nexus Solutions, the energy in the building immediately shifted. Julian Sterling carried a gravitational pull that commanded absolute silence. The receptionist stood up a little straighter, and the junior executives lingering by the elevators quickly stepped aside, parting like the Red Sea to let us through. We bypassed the standard security protocols, riding the executive elevator directly to the 40th floor in total silence. My heart was beating with a slow, steady rhythm. There was no anxiety, no lingering fear, only the icy, thrilling anticipation of absolute justice. We reached the heavy glass double doors of the boardroom. Through the transparent panels, I could see Marcus still smiling, still laughing, with the CEO practically tasting his new senior vice president title. Julian pushed the doors open. The heavy brass hinges glided silently, but the sheer presence of Julian Sterling entering the room caused an immediate breathless hush to fall over the executives. David, the CEO, rushed forward, his face stretched into an eager, accommodating smile. "Mr. Sterling." David greeted, extending his hand. "It is an absolute honor. We have all the final contracts laid out and ready for your signature. The entire board is thrilled to finalize this acquisition." Julian ignored the outstretched hand. He walked to the head of the massive glass conference table and looked down at the stacked legal documents. He did not smile. His expression was a mask of cold corporate indifference. "We will not be signing anything today, David," Julian stated, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the large room. "Before Sterling Global absorbs a single liability from this firm, we need to address a catastrophic irregularity in your financial disclosures. My audit team has spent the last 48 hours reviewing the discretionary spending and vendor payouts originating specifically from your sales division." Marcus's smile froze on his face. He shifted uncomfortably in his expensive suit, his fingers gripping the silver pen a fraction tighter. "Irregularities," David echoed, blinking in confusion. "Mr. Sterling, I assure you our internal accounting team has vetted every single ledger. Marcus here has run the tightest, most profitable ship in the company." Julian raised a single cynical eyebrow. "Is that so? Well, my team begs to differ. And frankly, I trust my team far more than I trust yours." Julian took a half step to the side, gesturing toward the open doorway. "Gentlemen," Julian announced, his voice ringing with absolute devastating clarity. "Meet my lead auditor, Ms. Caldwell." I stepped through the double doors. The crimson suit caught the morning light pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, making me look like a flare of fire against the gray walls. I walked slowly, deliberately into the room, my heels clicking like the ticking of a countdown clock against the polished hardwood floor. I did not look at the CEO. I did not look at the other board members. I locked my eyes directly onto Marcus. Marcus stopped breathing. The color violently drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. His jaw went slack, his eyes widening in sheer unadulterated terror as his brain desperately tried to process the impossible reality standing in front of him. I was not scrubbing floors. I was not a boring, glorified human calculator. I was the apex predator of Sterling Global, and I had his entire financial life in my hands. The silver Mont Blanc pen slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the glass conference table with a sharp, echoing clatter, rolling off the edge and dropping onto the floor. I walked to the chair directly across from him, set my heavily encrypted work laptop down on the glass, and offered him a slow, chilling smile. "Hello, Marcus," I said softly. "Let us talk about your numbers." The silence in the executive boardroom was so profound, it felt like a vacuum pulling the air directly from Marcus's lungs. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled onto dry land, completely incapable of forming a coherent syllable. The supreme confidence he had been radiating just moments ago had evaporated, replaced by a primal, suffocating panic. David, the CEO, looked rapidly between Julian, Marcus, and me. His eager smile had completely vanished, replaced by the sharp, calculating frown of a man who suddenly realized his ship was taking on water. "Mr. Sterling." David began, his voice tight. "I am not sure what kind of game this is, but Marcus has been one of our most trusted executives. What exactly are these irregularities your auditor claims to have found?" Julian did not even bother to look at David. He simply leaned against the heavy oak credenza at the back of the room, crossed his arms, and nodded toward me. My lead auditor will explain everything, Julian said, his tone chillingly casual. I suggest you listen very closely, David. It is about to get incredibly expensive for you if you do not. I opened my laptop and connected the secure cable to the boardroom projection system. With a single keystroke, the massive digital screens at the end of the table flared to life. I did not waste time with pleasantries or corporate jargon. I went straight for the jugular. I pulled up the exact third-quarter sales reports Marcus had just been boasting about. The charts were color-coded, meticulously organized, and completely fraudulent. I began systematically dissecting the numbers, speaking with a calm, surgical precision that left no room for debate. I highlighted the inflated revenue streams, pointing out how Marcus had prematurely logged projected sales as finalized contracts to artificially boost his quarterly performance metrics. But artificially inflating his numbers was merely a desperate attempt to secure his promotion. The real crime was the embezzlement. I switched the screen to display a secondary set of ledgers, ones hidden deep within the vendor payout accounts. Marcus attempted to speak, his voice a hoarse, desperate croak. David, he stammered, raising a trembling hand. This is a targeted attack. Serena is my estranged wife. We are going through a very bitter separation. She is clearly manipulating this data to sabotage my career. This is a massive conflict of interest. David turned his sharp gaze toward me, clearly waiting for a defense. I did not offer one. I let the data defend itself. Ms. Caldwell's marital status is completely irrelevant to the mathematics displayed on that screen, Julian interjected smoothly, his voice cutting through Marcus's pathetic defense like a razor. Numbers do not hold grudges, Marcus. They simply expose liars. Continue, Ms. Caldwell. I tapped the keyboard, bringing up a series of highly specific invoices. I directed the board's attention to the third column. As you can see, gentlemen, over the past 14 months, Nexus Solutions has paid out exactly $412,000 to an independent consulting firm listed as Alpha Vendor. These payments were authorized directly by Marcus, coded under emergency marketing expenditures, and bypassed standard secondary approval due to his executive clearance. Marcus began sweating profusely. The expensive fabric of his custom navy suit seemed to cling to him as his body temperature spiked. He reached up and yanked at his silk tie, the knot suddenly acting as a noose. His breathing was loud and ragged in the quiet room. According to the invoices submitted by Marcus, I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls. Alpha Vendor provided comprehensive market analysis and demographic modeling. However, a deep dive trace into the routing numbers associated with Alpha Vendor reveals that it is not a marketing firm at all. It is a shell company, an empty LLC registered in Delaware, designed specifically to funnel corporate funds directly into a private offshore holding account. David's face turned violently red. He slammed his hand flat against the glass table, making the water glasses rattle. Are you telling me my top sales executive has been stealing nearly $500,000 from this company? He demanded, glaring at Marcus. I am telling you he was sloppy, I corrected, pulling up the final devastating piece of evidence onto the massive screens. I displayed the incorporation documents for Alpha Vendor alongside a residential lease agreement I had pulled from our shared digital archives. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool glass, and stared directly into Marcus's terrified, sweating face. It's fascinating, Marcus, how this vendor's registered address matches the apartment you lease for your 24-year-old assistant. Can you explain that to the board? A collective gasp rippled through the room. One of the senior board members actually dropped his coffee mug, the dark liquid spilling unnoticed across the carpet. David looked like he was about to experience a cardiac event. Marcus was entirely destroyed. He looked around the room, his eyes wide and pleading, searching for a single friendly face. He found absolutely none. The CEO, who had just promised him a senior vice presidency, was now glaring at him with pure homicidal rage. The board members who had applauded his numbers were now whispering furiously to one another, pulling out their phones to likely contact internal security and the legal department. I sat back in my chair, allowing the absolute silence to crush him. I had warned him. I had told him that when I came for him, He would not even see the blade drop. He had thought he could discard me, humiliate me, and replace me without consequence. He thought he could steal from his company to fund a secret life and buy his mother's expensive country club status while I scrubbed the floors of his house. He was wrong. David stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. He pointed a trembling finger at Marcus. "You are terminated immediately!" David roared, his voice shaking with absolute fury. "I want security up here right now to escort this man off the premises and get General Counsel on the phone. We are handing every single piece of this evidence over to the federal authorities before the hour is out." Julian Sterling smiled, a cold, satisfied expression. He buttoned his suit jacket and turned to David. "Now that we have excised the rot from your infrastructure, David, perhaps we can sit down and discuss a heavily revised valuation for this acquisition. I believe Nexus Solutions just became significantly cheaper." I closed my laptop with a sharp, decisive click. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Marcus was still sitting in his chair, completely paralyzed, his entire life reduced to ash in less than 10 minutes. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my crimson suit, and walked past him without a second glance. I had executed my target flawlessly. The audit was complete. The complete finality of the moment refused to register in Marcus's desperately arrogant brain. Even as David shouted for security, even as the board members scrambled away from him as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease, Marcus refused to accept that he had been beaten. He shot up from his leather chair so violently that it tipped over backward, crashing against the credenza. He planted his hands flat on the glass table, his knuckles turning white as he leaned forward, panting heavily. "David, wait!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of sheer panic and misplaced authority. "You are not thinking straight. You cannot seriously be listening to her. Look at her. Look at who is presenting this so-called evidence." David paused, his hand hovering over the intercom button on the conference phone. The entire room froze, the heavy silence broken only by the sound of Marcus's ragged breathing. Marcus turned his desperate, wild eyes toward the board of directors, shifting into the aggressive, charismatic sales pitch mode that had always saved him in the past. He raised a hand, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. "She is my wife," Marcus announced, his voice dripping with fabricated outrage and condescension. "We are in the middle of an incredibly toxic, highly contested divorce. I filed the papers because her behavior became completely unmanageable. She is an angry, bitter, mentally unstable woman who cannot accept the fact that I am moving on with my life. She has spent the last month trying to destroy my personal assets, and now she is trying to sabotage the biggest professional deal of my career out of pure, psychotic spite." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the closed lid of my laptop. I did not defend myself. I did not need to raise my voice or stoop to his level of frantic name-calling. I simply watched him dig his own grave deeper into the bedrock. "She fabricated those LLC documents," Marcus insisted, turning his frantic gaze toward the CEO. "David, you know me. I brought in the quarterly numbers. I secured the regional accounts. I built the vendor expansion program from the ground up. Do you honestly think I would risk a senior vice president promotion for a few $100,000 in petty cash?" She hacked into the Nexus servers, manipulated the ledgers, and planted that residential lease agreement to frame my assistant. She is clinically unstable, David. This entire presentation is a malicious, targeted fabrication designed to ruin me. For a microscopic fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of doubt cross David's face. It was the natural, cowardly instinct of a corporate executive who desperately wanted to believe his own oversight had not allowed a massive embezzlement scheme to occur right under his nose. Acknowledging Marcus's guilt meant acknowledging his own failure as a CEO. Marcus saw that hesitation too, and he immediately moved to exploit it. Marcus turned his attention to Julian, attempting to establish a false sense of male camaraderie, a desperate appeal to the old boys club mentality. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, lowering his voice into a tone of respectful conspiratorial reason, "I apologize for bringing my domestic disputes into your boardroom. You are a man of logic and business. Surely you can see what is happening here. My ex-wife has a history of emotional volatility. She managed to con her way onto your audit team just to get access to these files. She is deeply unstable. If you just give my internal team 24 hours, we can prove these documents are forged and get this acquisition back on track without this hysterical woman interfering. The temperature in this boardroom seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. Julian Sterling did not blink. He did not shift his weight or change his expression. He simply took one slow, deliberate step forward and slammed his open palm flat against the mahogany credenza. The sound cracked through the room like a rifle shot, making half the board members physically jump in their seats. You will address my lead auditor with respect, or I will collapse this entire deal and let this company go bankrupt. Julian's voice was not a shout. It was a low, vibrating growl that carried the absolute crushing weight of a multi-billion-dollar empire. The sheer menace in his tone stripped the oxygen straight out of the room. Ms. Caldwell is the sharpest, most relentless financial mind I have ever had the pleasure of employing. Julian continued, his dark eyes locking onto Marcus, with the intensity of a predator viewing a very small, very pathetic prey. She did not con her way into my firm. I recruited her. She uncovered your pathetic amateur shell company in less than 12 hours. And if you ever refer to my lead auditor as hysterical again, I will personally ensure that your corporate blacklisting extends far beyond the borders of this country. The illusion shattered completely. The momentary doubt that had flickered across David's face instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, terrified clarity. The CEO glared at Marcus, his expression hardening into pure, unadulterated revulsion. David looked at Marcus and no longer saw a top-performing sales executive. He saw a radioactive liability. He saw a man who had not only stolen $500,000 from the company, but who had just profoundly insulted the billionaire investor holding the keys to their corporate salvation. Marcus was a contagion, and David realized he had to cut the infected limb off immediately before the rot spread to the rest of the board. "Shut your mouth, Marcus!" David snarled, his voice trembling with rage. "Do not say another word. You do not speak for Nexus Solutions anymore. You do not work here. You are nothing but a thief and a liability." Marcus stood frozen, his mouth hanging open. The adrenaline that had fueled his frantic defense finally evaporated, leaving him hollowed out and trembling. He looked around the vast, gleaming boardroom, suddenly realizing how incredibly small he was. There was no charm left to deploy. There were no more lies to spin. The pristine walls of his corporate castle had become a cage, and the exits were permanently sealed. Through the glass double doors, two large men in dark security uniforms appeared, flanked by the company's general counsel. David gestured sharply toward Marcus, and the guards stepped into the room, their expressions grim and unyielding. I stood up, smoothing the crimson fabric of my jacket. I picked up my encrypted laptop and walked slowly around the glass table, stopping just a few feet away from where Marcus was standing. He looked at me, his blue eyes wide and shining with unshed tears of absolute defeat. "I told you to be careful, Marcus," I said softly. My voice meant only for him. "I told you that actions have consequences. Your mother is currently picking out floral arrangements for your promotion gala, while Jamal is pacing her foyer, terrified of the federal tax audit I triggered on his accounts this morning. You thought you were untouchable. You thought you could throw me away. But the truth is, I am the one who built you, and I am the one who just tore you down." I did not wait for his response. I turned on my heel and walked out of the boardroom, the sound of the security guards grabbing Marcus by the arms echoing behind me. The golden child of the Caldwell family was finally facing reality, and I was already moving on to the next chapter. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, the frantic, muffled shouting of David still echoing behind me. Before the security guards could completely drag Marcus into the freight elevator, David stormed out into the hallway, his face purple with absolute rage. He blocked the elevator doors from closing, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly at Marcus's chest. "You are suspended without pay, effective this exact second," David roared, his voice bouncing off the polished marble walls. "You have 24 hours to produce every single cent of that $400,000. If that money is not back in our corporate accounts by tomorrow morning, the termination is permanent, and I am personally pressing federal embezzlement charges. Fix your mess, Marcus, or you are going straight to federal prison." Marcus vanished behind the heavy steel doors of the freight elevator, a broken, pathetic shell of the man who had confidently strutted into the building that morning. I walked alongside Julian to the main executive elevators. He did not say a single word until the doors slid shut, isolating us from the spectacular corporate chaos we had just ignited on the 40th floor. Julian turned to me, offering a slow, deeply approving nod. "Flawless execution." Julian murmured, his tone ringing with genuine professional respect. "You dismantled him with absolute surgical precision. Take the rest of the afternoon off, Ms. Caldwell. I will handle the final valuation negotiations with David. I imagine he is going to be incredibly accommodating to our new terms." I thanked him, stepping out into the expansive sunlit lobby and making my way toward the private underground parking garage. The adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins during the audit presentation was slowly beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, crystalline sense of absolute clarity. I had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. The subterranean garage was incredibly cool and dimly lit, the thick concrete walls echoing with the distant, steady hum of heavy ventilation fans. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and damp concrete. I walked purposefully toward the sleek black luxury sedan Julian had arranged for me, the rhythmic metallic click of my crimson stilettos cutting sharply through the oppressive silence. I was just reaching for the chrome door handle when a dark shadow abruptly detached itself from the concrete pillar near the rear bumper of my car. It was Marcus. He had somehow managed to slip away from the building security detail, likely utilizing his executive clearance badge one final time before the IT department completely deactivated his access. The sight of him was almost jarring. He looked utterly deranged, entirely stripped of his polished corporate armor. His custom-tailored navy suit jacket, which had fit him so perfectly just an hour ago, was now crumpled and hanging awkwardly off his slumped shoulders. His expensive silk tie had been ripped away and discarded. The top 3 buttons of his crisp white shirt were torn open, revealing a sheen of panicked sweat. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. He lunged forward, stopping just inches short of my personal space when I did not even bother to flinch. "Serena," he gasped, his voice a pathetic, reedy whine that lacked any of its usual arrogant resonance. "Serena, please. You have to stop this right now." I did not move. I did not cross my arms or step back. I simply looked at him with absolute glacial indifference. "Stop what exactly, Marcus?" I asked smoothly, my voice echoing slightly in the empty garage. "Stop the natural, undeniable consequences of your own financial crimes." He reached out his hands, visibly trembling, as he desperately tried to grab my arm, but I took a deliberate, sharp step backward. He let his hands fall limply to his sides, instantly recognizing that physical intimidation was useless. He shifted tactics immediately. The aggressive corporate manipulation was gone, replaced instantly by the pathetic, sniveling victim routine he had always deployed when he was backed into a corner and ran out of lies. "Come on, baby," Marcus pleaded, his voice breaking artificially as he attempted to force a look of deep, agonizing regret onto his sweating face. "We were good together. You know we were. We had a beautiful life. I was just stressed about the cancer. The medical bills, the endless hospital visits, the constant worry, it was all simply too much for me to handle. I made a terrible mistake, but I only did it because the pressure was completely destroying me. Don't do this to my career. Please, Serena. If David goes to the federal authorities, my entire life is over. I will lose everything." I stood there in the dim, flickering light of the parking garage, staring intently at the man I had once vowed to spend the rest of my life with. I let his words hang in the stagnant air between us, analyzing the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his statement. He was actually attempting to use my cancer diagnosis, the very illness during which he had mercilessly abandoned me to sleep with his 24-year-old assistant, as a valid excuse for embezzling $500,000 from his employer to fund a lavish secret lifestyle. The absolute narcissism required to weaponize my physical trauma to justify his corporate theft was staggering. It did not make me angry. It did not make me sad. It only served to completely validate every single action I had taken today. He was not experiencing genuine remorse for the devastation he had caused me. He was only sorry that his offshore bank accounts were currently frozen and his guaranteed promotion had been spectacularly detonated in front of his peers. I opened the heavy door of the black sedan and slid gracefully onto the plush leather seat. I hit the ignition button, the powerful engine purring to life with a quiet, menacing hum. Marcus stepped closer, grabbing the edge of the open window frame with both hands. His eyes were wide with desperate pleading terror. He honestly believed he could still talk his way out of this scenario. He genuinely thought his empty charm and manufactured tearful apologies could magically reverse the catastrophic implosion of his reality. I looked up at him from the driver's seat, my expression completely void of any sympathy, pity, or lingering affection. I was no longer the sick, discarded wife scrubbing his hardwood floors. I was the architect of his ruin. "I'm not doing anything to your career," I said, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper that cut through his panicked breathing. "You did it to yourself. See you at the gala." I pressed the master control button on the armrest. The heavily tinted glass window glided upward with smooth mechanical precision, forcing Marcus to snatch his trembling fingers away before they were crushed against the doorframe. I did not bother to look back in the rearview mirror as I put the luxury car in drive and accelerated smoothly toward the concrete exit ramp. I left him standing completely alone in the dark, suffocating shadows of the underground garage, choking on the exhaust of his own ruined life. The first phase of my absolute justice was flawlessly complete, but the grand finale was still waiting at his mother's opulent country club. The air in the Four Seasons ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, imported champagne, and the intoxicating electricity of newly acquired power. I had finally walked out of the shadow of their expectations, and tonight I was going to enjoy every second of the light. But Marcus was fundamentally incapable of accepting defeat gracefully. Despite the brutal reality check he had received in the parking garage hours earlier, he had somehow managed to crash the Sterling Global merger gala. He had deliberately brought his entire family to the event, a desperate, pathetic attempt to project a united and affluent front. He foolishly believed that parading Beatrice, Jamal, and Victoria through a room full of billionaires and industry titans would somehow save his severed reputation. He thought he could corner Julian Sterling in a social setting and manipulate him into offering a lifeline. I watched from the edge of the grand ballroom as Marcus navigated the crowd. He was sweating profusely through his rented tuxedo, his eyes wide and manic as he frantically scanned the room for Julian. Victoria was clinging to his arm, wearing a tight, uncomfortable smile, clearly terrified by the erratic energy Marcus was emitting. Jamal trailed behind them, looking entirely out of place and eager to flee. And then there was Beatrice. She marched through the elegant space with her chin held high, wearing a gaudy sequined gown that looked desperately out of touch among the refined, understated wealth of the other guests. Marcus spotted us standing near the grand ice sculpture at the center of the room. He broke away from his mother's side and practically sprinted toward Julian. He completely ignored me, stepping squarely in front of Julian and blocking our path to the main dining area. "Mr. Sterling?" Marcus pleaded, his voice trembling with a sickening mixture of arrogance and desperation. "Please, just give me 2 minutes of your time. You saw what happened today. David is a fool. He runs Nexus Solutions like an absolute dinosaur, but I control the clients. I control the regional accounts. I can bring my entire portfolio over to Sterling Global by tomorrow morning. I am a top-tier earner, Julian. You need someone with my killer instinct on your executive team." Julian stopped walking. He looked down at Marcus as if he had just stepped in something deeply unpleasant. He did not raise his voice, but the absolute disgust in his tone radiated through the immediate space. "You are a thief," Marcus, Julian stated with glacial precision. "You lack instinct, you lack loyalty, and you categorically lack intelligence. The only thing you are bringing to my firm is a federal subpoena. If you are not out of this ballroom in exactly 30 seconds, I will personally ensure your fraud investigation includes a detailed review of your immediate family's financial complicity." Marcus physically recoiled as if he had been struck. The realization that he could not charm or negotiate his way out of this catastrophe finally pierced his thick skull. Beatrice, witnessing her golden sun being completely dismantled in front of the city's elite, lost whatever fragile grip on reality she had left. She pushed past Jamal and marched directly up to me. Her face was contorted with a vicious, ugly rage that completely shattered her carefully cultivated high society facade. For years, I had swallowed her insults, enduring her endless passive-aggressive remarks about my upbringing and my worth. Tonight, she abandoned all pretense. She pointed a manicured finger at the diamond necklace resting against my collarbone. "Look at you, parading around with another man's money. You'll always be trash from the wrong side of the tracks." The string quartet playing near the bar seemed to fade into the background. Several high-profile guests turned their heads, their conversations halting as they watched the spectacle unfold. I did not shrink away from her venom. I did not let her words inflict the old familiar sting. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, until I was looking down directly into her furious, terrified eyes. "I am not parading around with another man's money, Beatrice," I replied, my voice projecting with absolute devastating clarity. "I am standing here entirely on my own merit. I earned my position at Sterling Global. I earned my seat at this table. You, however, have spent the last decade funding your country club memberships and luxury vacations, using the money your son stole from his employers. You are wearing a gown purchased with embezzled corporate funds. You are the absolute definition of a parasite." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her throat as the surrounding guests began to whisper furiously. "Your son is going to federal prison," I continued, refusing to break eye contact. "And the forensic audit I initiated this morning will meticulously track every single stolen dollar that flowed from his offshore accounts directly into your personal bank accounts. You called me trash, but by the end of the week, you will not even have a house to live in." Victoria let out a sharp, panicked sob. She grabbed Marcus by the arm, her nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "Is it true, Marcus?" she demanded, her voice shrill and hysterical. "Did you steal the money? Are they going to take the house? Are they going to freeze my accounts?" Marcus tried to shush her, desperately looking around at the wealthy onlookers, who were now openly staring at them with disgust. "Shut up, Victoria," he hissed, trying to pull his arm away. "I will fix it. I just need time to fix it." Jamal, who had remained entirely silent until this exact moment, suddenly backed away from his mother and his brother. He looked at Beatrice with absolute horror. "You knew," Jamal said, his voice shaking. "You knew he was stealing, and you let me take money from him for my business. You implicated me in federal fraud." The perfect superior family dynamic they had weaponized against me for years was completely tearing itself apart in the middle of the Four Seasons ballroom. They were turning on each other like starving wolves, their loyalty instantly vaporizing the second their fraudulent wealth was threatened. Two massive security guards in dark suits silently materialized behind Marcus and his family. Julian gave them a single curt nod. "It is time for you to leave, the head of security," said, placing a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder. They were corralled toward the service exit, stripped of their dignity, their wealth, and their social standing. Beatrice kept her head down, using her expensive clutch to shield her face from the watching crowd. Marcus stumbled forward, completely broken, his shoulders shaking as the reality of his impending incarceration finally crushed the last ounce of his ego. I stood beside Julian and watched the heavy oak doors close behind them. The toxic weight I had carried for years instantly vanished. The air in the ballroom felt lighter, the music sounded brighter, and the champagne tasted sweeter. Julian turned to me, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Shall we get back to the celebration, Miss Caldwell?" he asked, offering me his arm. "We certainly shall, Mr. Sterling," I replied, taking his arm and walking confidently into the center of the room. The past was finally dead, and the future belonged entirely to me. The orchestra seamlessly transitioned into a triumphant swelling chord that signaled the evening's main address, drawing the attention of the 500 elite guests in the ballroom. Julian guided me toward a reserved table at the very front of the room, right at the edge of the stage. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the intoxicating electricity of newly acquired power. Every eye in the room was fixed on Julian as he smoothly ascended the velvet steps to the podium. He adjusted the microphone with a practiced, effortless grace. The ambient chatter of the city's wealthiest investors, socialites, and corporate titans instantly dissolved into a breathless, anticipatory silence. I took my seat, picking up a crystal flute of champagne and turning my chair just slightly so I had a clear, unobstructed view of the service doors at the back of the ballroom. The security guards had paused there waiting for a catering crew to clear the narrow corridor before escorting Marcus and his family out of the building. Marcus was pinned against the heavy oak doors, completely trapped in the room as Julian tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice resonating through the state-of-the-art sound system, wrapping the room in a commanding, absolute authority. "Tonight we celebrate more than just a successful fiscal quarter. We are here to officially announce the finalization of a monumental partnership. Nexus Solutions has built a formidable regional portfolio, and incorporating their infrastructure into the Sterling Global Network marks a defining moment for both of our organizations." Polite, enthusiastic applause rippled through the crowd. I watched David, the CEO of Nexus, puff out his chest at a nearby table, completely oblivious to the massacre that was about to unfold. Julian raised a hand, calling for quiet. The room instantly obeyed. He looked out over the sea of faces, his gaze cold, calculated, and utterly uncompromising. He stared directly at the back of the room, locking eyes with the trembling, pathetic figure of Marcus Caldwell. "This acquisition is complete. However, Sterling Global operates on integrity. Effective immediately, Marcus Caldwell is terminated for embezzling $800,000 of corporate funds." The silence that slammed into the ballroom was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum of sound so profound that I could hear the sharp collective intake of breath from the guests sitting 3 tables away. David froze in his seat, the smug smile wiped completely from his face, replaced instantly by an expression of unadulterated, blood-draining horror. Behind Julian, the 3 massive 50-foot digital projection screens that had previously displayed the elegant Sterling Global logo abruptly went black. A split second later, they flashed to life with blinding, high-definition clarity. Julian had not just threatened Marcus. He had weaponized the entire audiovisual department to execute him. The center screen displayed a massive, undeniable spreadsheet. It was the master ledger I had meticulously audited, with every single fraudulent wire transfer highlighted in glowing radioactive red. The routing numbers, the dates, the exact amounts funneled out of Nexus accounts and redirected into offshore shell companies were broadcast for every billionaire and board member in the room to scrutinize. The left and right screens illuminated with a slideshow of high-resolution photographs. They were vivid, incredibly detailed images of a sprawling luxury penthouse apartment. The screens flashed pictures of imported Italian velvet sofas, custom marble countertops, and a walk-in closet lined from floor to ceiling with designer handbags and diamond jewelry. The final photograph was a crystal-clear shot of Marcus's 24-year-old assistant posing on the balcony of that exact penthouse, holding a glass of champagne with the city skyline glittering behind her. Superimposed over the image was the residential lease agreement bearing Marcus's forged signature and the Nexus corporate seal. Gasps echoed through the ballroom, sharp and scandalized. The silence shattered into a deafening roar of frantic whispers, shocked exclamations, and the unmistakable sound of smartphone cameras clicking wildly as the city's elite scrambled to document the spectacular destruction of a rising corporate star. At the back of the room, the illusion of the Caldwell family completely and violently disintegrated. Beatrice let out a high, thin wail, her hands flying to her face as she realized that her social standing, her country club reputation, and her entire fabricated identity were currently being broadcast as a criminal joke on a 50-foot screen. She looked at the faces of her wealthy friends and acquaintances, people she had spent decades trying to impress, and saw nothing but revulsion and mocking pity. Her knees buckled. She sank toward the patterned carpet, only kept upright because Jamal grabbed her arm in a blind panic. Jamal did not try to comfort his mother. He was already looking over his shoulder, his eyes wide with the terrified realization that federal investigators would be looking into his own business loans by morning. He dropped Beatrice's arm, shoved past the security guards, and bolted through the service doors, abandoning his family to save himself. Victoria was completely paralyzed. She stood frozen next to Marcus, her eyes locked on the massive photograph of the young, beautiful assistant living in a penthouse funded by her husband's stolen money. The absolute humiliation of the betrayal washed over her face. She looked at Marcus, who was hyperventilating, his hands clawing desperately at his own collar as if he were suffocating. Victoria did not scream. She did not cry. She simply turned around, lifted the hem of her expensive designer gown, and walked away from him, disappearing into the crowd without a single backward glance. Marcus was left entirely alone. He stood trembling between the two massive security guards, illuminated by the harsh, glaring light of his own documented crimes. The entire ballroom had turned to face him. 500 of the most powerful people in the country were staring at him with utter disgust. He raised his hands weakly, trying to shield his face from the flashing cameras, looking like a cornered animal, realizing there was no escape. The security guards finally grabbed him by the arms, dragging him backward through the heavy wooden doors and out of the light. I sat perfectly still at my table, lifting my crystal flute to my lips and taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of champagne. The sweet, crisp liquid coated my throat as I watched the screens fade back to the Sterling Global logo. Julian stepped away from the podium, leaving the room buzzing with the electric, chaotic energy of a freshly executed corporate slaughter. He walked down the velvet steps and took the empty seat beside me. I did not look at him right away. I kept my eyes on the service doors where Marcus had vanished. I thought about the cold, sterile hospital rooms. I thought about the agonizing months of chemotherapy, the nights I spent curled on the bathroom floor while Marcus was out spending stolen money on his mistress. I thought about the absolute crushing despair of believing my life was over and the realization that the man I loved was waiting for me to die. It was all gone. The victim they had tried to bury was dead, and the woman who had taken her place had just burned their entire world to ash. I turned to Julian, offering him a serene, perfectly calculated smile. "That was a wonderful presentation, Mr. Sterling," I said softly, my voice completely steady over the roar of the crowd. Julian raised his own glass, tapping it gently against mine with a quiet, ringing chime. "Only the best for my lead auditor, Ms. Caldwell," he replied, his dark eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. "Welcome to your new life." I set my crystal flute down on the crisp white linen of the table, the delicate chime of the glass completely drowned out by the rising crescendo of panic at the back of the ballroom. Julian's words were the perfect, lethal punctuation to Marcus's downfall, but the Caldwell family's reckoning was not quite finished. At the edge of the service corridor, the reality of the situation was violently short-circuiting Beatrice's brain. She could not process the fact that she was no longer the matriarch of a wealthy, untouchable dynasty. She scrambled up from the patterned carpet, her sequined gown catching the harsh light of the chandeliers in a jarring display of ruined elegance. She grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his suit jacket before he could completely slip through the heavy oak doors, hauling him backward into the room with surprising adrenaline-fueled strength. She then snapped her head toward Victoria, whose attempt to quietly exit had been thwarted by a dense wall of whispering, wide-eyed guests who were thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. Beatrice lunged, sinking her manicured fingers into Victoria's arm and dragging her back into the center of the Caldwell's rapidly expanding circle of humiliation. "Jamal, call your father's lawyers!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cutting through the ambient murmur of the ballroom like a rusted blade. "Victoria, get your father to bail Marcus out." She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting wildly around the room as she desperately attempted to command a reality that no longer existed. She genuinely believed that her old connections, the phantom wealth of her ex-husband and Victoria's supposedly affluent family, could magically construct a safety net to catch them. I did not remain seated. I stood up, the crimson fabric of my gown trailing behind me as I walked toward the stage. The elite guests parted for me instinctively, their eyes filled with a mixture of absolute awe and morbid fascination. I walked up the velvet steps, taking the space Julian had just vacated, and stepped directly to the podium. I leaned into the microphone. The sheer authoritative feedback from the sound system instantly silenced the entire ballroom. 500 faces turned toward me. "Victoria's dad can't help Beatrice," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, smooth, resonant, and lethally calm. "He's running from the IRS. In fact, why don't you check your retirement app right now?" Jamal drained it to pay for Victoria's fake lifestyle. The words hung in the freezing air of the Four Seasons, absolute and devastating. Beatrice froze, the frantic, commanding energy completely drained from her body. Her mouth hung slightly open as she slowly turned her head to look at Jamal. Jamal could not meet her gaze. He shrank back, his face a terrifying shade of pale green, his eyes glued to the floor. Victoria let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp, stepping away from the family as if trying to physically distance herself from the incoming blast radius. Beatrice released Victoria's arm. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely open the clasp of her designer clutch. She fumbled for her phone, her perfectly manicured nails clicking frantically against the glass screen. She held the device up to her face, her eyes squinting against the harsh digital glare as she opened her banking application. The entire ballroom watched in absolute breathless silence. We watched the exact microscopic second that Beatrice Caldwell realized her life savings, her precious country club funds, and her entire financial safety net had been completely vaporized. A sound tore from Beatrice's throat. It was not a cry or a sob. It was a visceral, feral scream of pure, unadulterated agony. It was the sound of a woman whose entire universe had just been fundamentally erased. She did not look at Jamal. She lunged directly at Victoria. Beatrice tackled her daughter-in-law with the blinding speed of a predator. The two women crashed into a nearby cocktail table, sending crystal glasses and floral centerpieces shattering onto the polished floor. Beatrice grabbed a fistful of Victoria's meticulously styled hair, shrieking incoherently as she slapped and clawed at the younger woman. Victoria screamed desperately, trying to protect her face, her expensive silk gown ripping audibly as she thrashed against the marble tiles. The wealthy, refined guests of the Sterling Global Gala scrambled backward in absolute horror, forming a wide, terrified circle around the brawl. Men in bespoke tuxedos pulled their wives away drinks, spilling completely aghast at the violent, trashy spectacle unfolding in the middle of their elite corporate merger. Jamal finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He threw himself into the chaotic tangle of limbs and shredded silk, desperately trying to pull his mother off his sister-in-law. "Mom, stop it." Jamal sobbed, wrapping his arms around Beatrice's waist and trying to drag her backward. "It is gone. The money is all gone. Just stop." Beatrice spun around and slapped Jamal squarely across the face. The sharp crack echoed loudly over the gasps of the crowd. "You stole from me!" she shrieked, her face streaked with mascara and sweat. "You stole everything!" Before Jamal could recover, the heavy main doors of the ballroom burst open. The flashing red and blue lights of multiple squad cars reflected wildly off the lobby glass outside. Half a dozen uniformed police officers, flanked by two plainclothes detectives, marched into the room with heavy, authoritative strides. The crowd parted instantly, creating a clear, unobstructed path. The lead detective did not even look at the screaming women on the floor. He walked directly toward the service corridor where the Sterling Global Security team had detained Marcus. A moment later, Marcus was dragged back into the light of the ballroom. His hands were securely locked in heavy steel handcuffs behind his back. "Marcus Caldwell," the detective announced, his voice booming over the chaos of the room. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of insurance fraud, corporate embezzlement, and wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Marcus looked up. His eyes were completely vacant, staring through the crowd without seeing a single face. He was a dead man walking. The police officers hauled him forward, marching the golden child of the Caldwell family, directly past his weeping, ruined brother and his hysterical, violent mother. I stood at the podium looking down at the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to bury me. I did not feel a shred of pity. I felt nothing but the warm, brilliant glow of total, undeniable justice. The officers pulled him forward with a brutal, unyielding force, completely ignoring his sudden, desperate resistance. He twisted his neck, his eyes locking onto mine with a pleading, terrified intensity that I had never seen before. Serena Marcus screamed, his voice shattering in the cavernous, vaulted room. Serena. The officers did not slow down. They marched him swiftly through the heavy wooden service doors. The doors slammed shut behind him with a resounding thud, cutting off his pathetic cries and permanently sealing his fate. At my feet, the remnants of the Caldwell family were completely disintegrating. Victoria scrambled up from the debris of the shattered cocktail table, looking like a discarded rag doll. Her silk gown was torn, hanging in uneven, ruined strips, but she did not care. She snatched her handbag from the floor, desperate to flee, but the cheap stitching of her fake Birkin finally gave way under the strain. The bottom ripped open entirely, spilling lipstick's loose change and crumpled receipts across the polished marble floor. She let out a mortified, choking sob. Ignoring the mess entirely, she bolted for the nearest exit in tears, fleeing blindly from the judging, merciless stares of the billionaires surrounding her. Beatrice remained collapsed on the floor. The woman who had built her entire identity on looking down at others was now weeping uncontrollably in a puddle of spilled champagne and broken glass. She was utterly humiliated, utterly exposed, and completely, undeniably broke. The elite guests simply stepped around her, murmuring in disgusted, hushed tones, as hotel security finally moved in to physically escort the sobbing, ruined woman off the premises. I stepped down from the podium, my heart steady and my mind remarkably clear. Julian walked up to me, his dark eyes reflecting the sparkling light of the chandeliers above. The ballroom around us was still buzzing with shock and scandalized whispers, but in that specific moment it felt as though we were the only two people in the room. He stopped right in front of me and reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a velvet box, snapped it open to reveal a massive, flawless diamond ring, and smoothly dropped to one knee, right there on the ballroom floor. "You survived the table," Julian said, his voice low, steady, and filled with absolute devotion. "I kept my end of the bargain. Marry me." I looked down at him, the heavy armor I had worn for years finally melting away completely. A genuine, radiant smile broke across my face, the first true, unburdened smile I had felt in what seemed like a lifetime. "Okay," I said. He slipped the heavy, glittering ring onto my finger and stood pulling me into a kiss as the ballroom finally erupted into genuine, enthusiastic applause. 6 months later, the air tasted entirely different. It was crisp, salty, and completely unburdened. My doctor had officially declared me completely cancer-free during my last scan. The grueling treatments were a thing of the past, and my physical strength had returned with full, vibrant force, a physical triumph that perfectly mirrored the corporate victory I had secured. I was no longer a discarded wife or a sick liability to be hidden away. I was running my own mergers and acquisitions division at Sterling Global. I commanded a sprawling corner office that overlooked the entire city skyline, executing multi-million-dollar deals with the same ruthless precision I had used to dismantle my past. The justice I had engineered had played out flawlessly. Marcus, terrified of a public trial exposing the full pathetic depths of his greed, had taken a plea deal. He was currently serving a mandatory 5-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. He had traded his custom-tailored suits and corporate dinners for a standard-issue uniform and a concrete cell the exact size of his former walk-in closet. There was no charm left to save him, no mother to bail him out, and no naive wife to exploit. Jamal and Victoria's toxic, fraudulent marriage had imploded mere weeks after the gala. Stripped of Marcus's stolen funds, their grand fabricated illusion of wealth could no longer be maintained. They divorced bitterly, fighting over the worthless scraps of a life built on lies. Victoria, no longer a faux socialite parading in fake designer gear, was currently working the early morning shift as a barista in a busy suburban coffee shop. She spent her days wearing a stained apron, forced to smile and serve overly complicated espresso drinks to the very same wealthy women she used to look down upon. Beatrice was living in a cramped, rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, her country club memberships permanently revoked, and her social standing entirely obliterated. I stood on the polished teak deck of Julian's private yacht, the warm afternoon sun beating down on my bare shoulders. The gentle, rhythmic sway of the ocean was deeply calming. Julian walked up from the cabin and wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, pressing a soft kiss to my temple as we looked out over the endless, glittering expanse of the water. I leaned back into his embrace, raising my crystal flute of champagne. He raised his to meet mine. The sharp, bright chime of crystal clinking against crystal rang out over the waves, the ultimate sound of sweet, absolute revenge. The most powerful lesson from this story is that true security and self-worth can never be granted by toxic people. They must be forged from within. When faced with ultimate betrayal, Serena didn't just survive, she meticulously turned her deepest pain into her greatest weapon. The people who tried to break her only provided the catalyst for her to build an untouchable, authentic life. It teaches us that walking away from manipulation and reclaiming our own narrative is the ultimate victory, proving that living well and thriving is undeniably the sweetest revenge. Have you ever turned a major setback into your greatest success? Share your comeback story in the comments below.